Well, I'm really honored to be invited to join the august group of speakers you have this season. Of necessity, because I wasn't here for all of them, I'm going to overlap somewhat. But I have a bit of a summary of what some of them said, and I'm hoping what I can do as you move towards closure in this series is to weave a more comprehensive tapestry of the issues at play in the Delta. And it's an issue, starting with the very human dimension, it's an issue where you stand, as the old adage goes, where you stand kind of depends on where you sit, and where the adage about the group of blindfolded people trying to figure out what an elephant is and just being able to touch a part think it's a very different creature. I would tell you the joke or the story, but I'm terrible at doing that. That is very much the case in the Delta, and I've worked at it from a number of different perspectives, including actually running a local government water agency down in Southern California. And frequently the problem is that people only see or work with a particular slice of the issue. And that is really part of the problem and why it's been so hard for it to come together. So as someone who's worn a lot of hats looking at the Delta over a bunch of decades, I hope my perspective adds a little something to the mix of all you've heard over the course of this series. First of all, I want to say I'm not speaking on behalf of the State Board. I'm going to give them a little plausible deniability, and I'm not just going to talk about what the State Board is doing. I'm just going to talk as an observer and sometimes participant in these efforts. What one of my friends used to say, that she was really not an expert, she was more of an eminent anecdotalist, and I think given my voyage, that really fits for me. Okay, so Yogi Berra, it's spring training, so I have to drop Yogi Berra. I apologize to those of you who are sick of Yogi Berra or haven't ever heard of Yogi Berra. But one of my favorite quotes from Yogi is, "It's hard to make predictions, especially about the future." And so I'm going to open with my conclusions as opposed to making you wait to see what they are. And I have to say, I'm optimistic. And I woke up this weekend feeling more optimistic than I have been for quite a long time. So I decided to shed the era of decision or doom title that was advertised for the moment, but I couldn't completely drop the fact that it may not come together. So I came up with convergence or collision, which is a little bit more appropriate in the governance context. But the reason that came to me in the first instance is that the protagonists in this drama frequently speak in absolutes. It's all this, it's all that. If I don't get everything I want, the whole thing falls apart, which any of you who've ever been in any negotiation or any public policy issue or any legislative issue know it is not how things move forward. They move forward in this inelegant, imperfect, kind of messy way where at some point some collection of individuals decide that it's worth it to compromise on some of their absolute positions and say yes to something that's actually in their interests or their clients' interests. And that's what I think will happen in the Delta. So over time, as things haven't happened, obviously, and as people have spoken in absolutes, things have gotten worse for the fish, certainly, and you heard a lot about that from earlier speakers. And clearly, the water supply reliability is more greatly at risk than we thought even a few years ago. So I think a number of things are coming together that are going to lead to a breakthrough, and I have three reasons for that. First, overall, and I'll show this to you in a little while, the state is taking far more leadership on more fronts dealing with its own water issues and the Delta than in decades. I think the last, I want to say 5 to 7 years have been astonishing for someone who, like me, in the 90s as a federal official had to step in and actually set water quality standards for the state of California because the state hadn't done it. At the same time, we were obviously doing it in air and a number of regions. So over the years, there is a sense that California is the most evolved environmentally, and that is largely true across this country. But there are moments where California inexplicably has not taken a leadership role in matters that have to do with its own economic and environmental future. And I'm just happy to see that the agencies are now working all on task. I mean, will it all work out? I don't know, but people are all working hard and they're focused on the tasks in front of them, in contrast to the 90s where the feds had to play the leadership role and drag them along. Second, there's more to that. I'm not critiquing anyone, but I can talk about it more if you want, but that's what happened. Second, there really is more appreciation of the fact on players really in virtually every corner of this thing that it actually isn't all or nothing. And that dealing with water and managing water in California isn't all one thing or another. It's a mix of many solutions rather than one big state-imposed solution, or worse yet, federally imposed solution. Jay's point in his lecture about local leadership, I think, gave you a picture about some of the things that are happening at the local level, and I'm going to talk about a few more of them. Phil Eisenberg's point about how the BDCP dialogue is evolving to where the water users agreed to less than what they wanted in the announcement that came out in July of 2012 was actually really big. It was a move away from the barricades. And then just earlier this year, a number of people in the environmental community actually came out with an alternative to be studied that said yes to some form of conveyance and yes to some forms of storage, which is a huge step beyond the absolutes of years before. That was very encouraging. So you're seeing it on all sides. Now, is there a clear path? No, definitely not. But is there an opportunity to muddle or noodle our way towards a significant series of improvements? And I would say the answer is yes. So I'm probably with Jeff Mount, who this morning on KQED, I hope, listen to the podcast if you didn't hear it. It was really great, and Jeff is just inimitable, just incredible. But he gave it about a 50-50 chance, and I think I'm going to go even 60-40 optimist. You can call me on it 2 years from now, but I think it'll be a messy couple of years, but I think you're going to see more decision-making happen in California than has happened in decades, so it should be an exciting time. So again, the question is going to be whether we at the state and federal level can do our job in a way that converges with enough stakeholders to move forward versus just compounding the drama. And again, my prediction is that it will, but it's not really going to be obvious until later. So here's what I'm going to talk about. I'm going to zip through some of the overview just in case this is open to the public, so not everybody has been at all of these sessions, and we can obviously come back to them later and talk about whatever it is you'd like to speak about when I'm done. Again, I'll try and give you a few more parts of the elephant in one place than you're probably used to getting. I think the other thing that happens generally, and the reason that happens, is that the dialogue on a given effort tends to be driven by the people who happen to be in the room at the time with a deal mentality. And I think there are a lot of things happening now that are out in the public eye all at the same time. So I think it's possible that we can actually weave a tapestry of efforts, even from separate sources, that will take care of more of the issues than the small rooms tend to do. And then finally, there are issues that just have to do with the humans who happen to be in the room. And some of you in this room have heard me do my lecture, which I'm not going to do for you today, on the challenge of ecosystem management actually being the biggest challenge, not ecosystem management or economics or politics or legislative hoo-ha or you name it, but actually just dealing with the people who happen to be in the room. And so things come together when there are enough players in enough places in and out of government who say they want to hold hands and move forward on something versus being comfortable and staying back in their places. And it's not something they make a decision for all time. It happens in fits and starts. It happens in the decisions, individual decisions that individual players make on a given day in a given room when they wake up in the morning or when they walk into that room. And so there's a certain mystery about things moving forward, but I think there are a lot of opportunities here. Governance. I am going to talk about governance a fair amount, but not just about governance, but just to say the whole notion of governance is a pretty broad one. To my mind, it can be the whole issue, it can be a particular piece of that issue, it can be for an institution, it could be a given project, it can actually be how we as people interact with each other in a given setting. So I'll probably talk about a fair number of those things. Here's a picture for those of you who haven't seen it enough. Again, just to remind you, by virtue of having been to even one of these sessions, you are probably ahead of what I think of as the 99% of Californians who actually don't understand what the Delta is or how it works. I know Jeff this morning said he thought, or maybe the reporter told him he thought surveys had said 80%. I think a big bunch of that 20% that say they know what's going on, they're just lying, or they were embarrassed to answer the question correctly, because I have rarely found people who actually know it beyond a particular fragmentary view. Again, key factor, this channelization of the delta that took place in the 1800s, or started in the 1800s and continued, the levees with the peat soil behind them that have subsided. I'm assuming you know all of this. There are some islands are 20 and 30 feet below sea level. That's kind of what precipitates our problem. Wonderful things, no casting aspersions on the delta. I love the delta, and if you haven't spent any time driving through the delta and going to some of the towns there, you're missing something, and it really, I think, is an essential part of understanding kind of the magic and the beauty of the delta and why people in the delta are fighting so hard to preserve it, and why sometimes their fears may seem outsized to some of the more jaded participants in these dramas. They have a lot at stake, and there's a lot of wonder in it, and preserving that is important and is even a part of the legislation I'm going to talk about in just a minute. As you look at part of what the challenge is here, though, if you look at the bottom, it's hard to tell. I have a laser pointer, but down in the bottom right of the channelized part, you have the San Joaquin coming in kind of around the bottom and then curving through the delta. That, give or take, I've seen different numbers, maybe about 20% of the inflow into the delta. The big part up above, somehow, there's a few bypasses in there. You've got the Sacramento River, which is more like 80%. And that's important because as fish, particularly in the San Joaquin, are trying to find their way out or their way home, the channelization itself poses a problem for them where they kind of get lost. It's a miracle what salmon can do, both getting out to the sea and, more importantly, smelling their way home years later. But the channelization of this makes it very difficult. What makes it almost impossible, and you've seen this before, I understand, is reverse flows. By putting those giant pumps at the bottom when the State Water Project was created, you created a marvel of modern engineering, but you also created something that just changes those flows dramatically. So as fish are trying to get home and smell their way to their native streams, if you've got reverse flows, they can't smell their way there. I'm oversimplifying it. And as they try to migrate as small smolts, they get caught up in these channels. You know, it's not like they can read street signs, little fish signs saying this way, and they end up in eddies. They don't make it to the main stem, and they really become food for predators, which is an enormous issue of growing importance, or at least growing interest in the dialogue. I put this here not to spend any time, but also to remind you, having borrowed a few of Rick Frank's slides, which is why you see the UC Davis logo on that, you see how much infrastructure is in the Delta. There are two things to note about that. One is that there are oil pipelines, there are gas pipelines, there are telecommunications, there's a lot, which suggests that there's actually an interest in the Delta for a lot of people who have no idea that they have an interest in the Delta beyond water. And so the stability of the Delta, which is threatened clearly by earthquake, which I think is a more remote risk of a catastrophic, it's sort of a low risk but high impact event. But the fact that we are estimating a 55-inch sea level rise by the end of the century and a more intensity of storm surges suggests that these fragile levees, even if we bolster them somewhat, are at risk. And so there's more at risk than water in the Delta, and you can see it more on a later slide. There are more exports or diversions from the Delta than just the export pumps at the bottom. Just a sense of the statewide reliance on this matters to a lot of California, and then just a sense of all the varying water projects built around California, a couple of which bisect the Delta, and most particularly the line that San Francisco has from Hetch Hetchy down, diverting from the Tuolumne, and East Bay Mud, which takes its water from the Mokelumne and I think some American River, but I'm not entirely sure, I'll get that wrong. So it's complicated. Now groundwater, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on groundwater. Is anyone, Jay, talked about groundwater? I just wanted a placeholder for this, if not, because it is a huge piece.
A little bit. Yeah, go ahead.
Oh, it's a little piece. And it's sort of mega governance because we don't really have statewide governance, and if you didn't know that, it was sort of important to know. I'm not suggesting that we have to have it. I'm just saying that it's 40–60% of the water use in California in any given year. And if you just followed the dialogue about California water and the Delta, you would think it was just about export pumps in California. It's regulated at the local level, and in some cases it's regulated really well at the local level. At other places it's not. We have clear authority at the state board on quality issues. There are many issues on quantity. We just can't touch it. There may be some small instances, but it's an odd thing being in charge of water supply and water rights for the state of California and not being able to deal with the quantity issues. Again, just to put it in context, California is one of the few states to not have a statewide regulatory system of some kind, and it is it's a key issue. Of course, if you haven't seen this is just everybody's favorite slide. That sign up at the top is where the floor of the valley was in 1925. That's how much subsidence you've had. And subsidence has all kinds of issues. It's groundwater overdraft, but it has all kinds of issues for infrastructure under the ground, for the ability even to use gravity in water conveyance. If it changes, water doesn't flow uphill. It has some pretty huge impacts, and frankly, if you let it compact enough, you can't then refill it. This is not just something you can expand back up to the top of the telephone pole, so that's storage that's lost to us forever in a time that we really need to be thinking about storage. So let's go back to the plumbing a little bit, talking about the modern era. I suspect you've seen this, so I'm not going to spend any time on it, just to note that the Central Valley Project and the State Water Project were built before all kinds of federal and state acts that would have suggested a review and perhaps a decision that the pumps shouldn't have been put where they were put in the first place for the reasons I gave you and a few more. Again, back to the plumbing, just to give you, again, a little bit of the scale and a sense that it's connected to the ocean out through the bay. And I talked about sea level rise. It's a huge issue within the Delta Stewardship Council work. I don't know if Phil talked about that. The risk of collapse is important, particularly to life and property of the people who live in the Delta. Secondarily to the water supply of Southern California, and I would say, and then thirdly probably to that infrastructure. The other key issue with climate to know is that over, and again, I may be repeating what you've heard, but 50–60% of all the storage where water is held, so when it falls in the winter as snow and melts out during the spring and summer when it's needed, 50–60% of all of our storage is in snowpack. And that's estimated to dramatically be reduced, which will make the water picture in California that much more volatile and that much more challenging. So then we move beyond plumbing, and you had the first attempt to do a peripheral canal to kind of fix that issue in the system, and the peripheral canal would have taken water further up in the Sacramento River, and to oversimplify it, the idea is there's more water flowing there. You can take it up there and not create reverse flows. There's still an issue about how much flow the fish need for a variety of reasons. I'm going to get to that in a minute, but you can more effectively take even the same amount of water with less harm to the fish. Again, a gross simplification, but it has always been the right engineering answer, but it devolved into the north-south fear and dialogue and an alliance of environmental community, people in Northern California and interest in the Delta that were able to have it defeated at the polls. Then in the 80s and the 90s, towards the end of the 80s, the State Water Resources Control Board was moving forward to set some really good water quality control provisions for the Bay and Delta. I'll explain what those are in a few minutes. And Governor Wilson challenged the federal government. He pulled back the standards and said, we're not going to do this until the federal government, including its endangered species agencies, the National Marine Fisheries Service and the Fish and Wildlife Service, get their act together and can deal with this in a coordinated fashion. Because we can do what we can do, but if they come out with rulings that say stop the pumps, etc., it kind of messes us up. Again, oversimplification. So the federal government, at this point, I came in a little bit after this, hadn't been appointed yet to EPA, but the federal agencies, under some really strong leadership from EPA and Interior in particular, pulled together what we call Club Fed, which was to at least get the Fed's house in order. I'm not going to get into this, but this was a huge governance deal, with one hand not knowing what the other one was doing. And once we had it together, EPA actually had been sued and stepped in the place of the state to propose water quality standards. And then we spent a very intensive year in particular coming up with what was known as the Bay Delta Accord, when people said peace has broken out, at least temporarily, where we had agreement on what the state would put into its standards so that EPA could step out, and then a multiple year period where we worked towards some far-ranging agreements on a variety of issues related to Bay Delta in particular. In that, the thing I would note was that the peripheral canal was off the table, and I was one of the people who took it off the table because I thought there was no way we could make progress on this whole range of issues if that was in the room. Nobody would be able to deal with anything else. But we did deal with storage. Oddly enough, today the discussion's all about conveyance, and storage seems to be left off the table, and I still don't understand why that is, although I bought more than a couple of people a beer to get their theory on why that is and what needs to happen. Then in the 2000s, you had a period of stasis in a way. Maybe people may not like this. The feds really weren't as interested in California. The state did some really cool things under Prop 50 that started the Integrated Water Resource Planning program, which you're going to hear about from Mark Cowan. It's incredible, and again, it's part of my punchline and why I'm optimistic. In addition to that proposal, incenting people to get to the table who dealt with a particular area but hadn't really gotten together to figure out how they could work through the flood control, water supply, water quality, stormwater issues in one place. It kind of under the tantalizing opportunity of getting some grant money, it got people in a lot of places to sit in a room to see if they could work something out, and in a lot of places they have. I mean, it was really brilliant, and I think an effort that's probably worth study in its own right. You see what's there. You probably heard about the litigation and the biological opinions coming out of the fish agencies. I'm not going to talk about those, but they are very significant background and backdrop to what's happening now. But then finally, by the late 2000s, Governor Schwarzenegger stepped in and created the Delta Vision Task Force, which Phil Eisenberg chaired and had quite a few luminaries on. It was really quite terrific. So you had the Delta Vision Task Force, and out of the Delta Vision Task Force came enough consensus from enough players to start moving legislation. I'm going to talk a little bit about that legislation in a minute. It's a very important backdrop, and it's very important in the sense that it was the first big step forward, certainly by the legislature, but in California, again, in decades. I'm going to talk a bit about the big three that I have in red that I know the best, and that's not to say that the biological opinions aren't important. They are, or that certainly the water bond isn't important. If you talk to people in the legislature or just people who are political, all they want to talk about is the water bond, and I'm happy to talk about it. Just know it was $11 billion. It's been postponed twice because of the economy. It has a Christmas tree of things in it, a lot of which are incredibly good. And that it would be great to be able to do, and that'll be something that the legislature spends a lot of time. And then again, the changed circumstances, and I talked a bit. Delta Reform Act, very important from a governance perspective. Again, people just talk about the water bond, but it actually had 4 other pieces of legislation and policy. One, a step forward, particularly on urban water conservation of 20% by 2020. There are some places that have been doing that for a long time, particularly in Southern California, but bringing everybody else up to that level, that's a lot of water. And getting ag conservation started. Ag conservation is harder than urban conservation. They're not one-to-one. One person's ag return is somebody else's source, or a refuge's source, or it recharges groundwater, so it's just way more complicated than urban. Water rights got some enforcement staff that it took until, I think, last year to actually get on board, I think, but that was a big deal because the water rights enforcement just hadn't been happening, and that's the fairness and equity piece around all of this. Groundwater, we couldn't get that much, but a little bit of at least each county had to report to the Department of Water Resources what the status of their groundwater basins are. It was like a little baby step. And then the biggest part was governance. Not just creating the Delta Stewardship Council, but declaring the co-equal goals of water supply reliability and ecosystem restoration as the policy of the state. That may seem obvious to you, but it hasn't been. What basically the legislature was saying is not a teeter-totter of which one of those wins depending on who's in power, but that the goal is to balance the two of them, and that both of them are important to the state. And this has ramifications for the approach people have to be taking to the variety of things that they do, and it also acknowledged that we had to do it in a way that acknowledged the importance of the Delta as a place, an evolving place, not set in stone, but an evolving place. Created a bunch of other institutions, had the Water Board do what was called a flow criteria report that basically was about if the fish could talk, what would the fish ask for, as a counterpoint to what the water suppliers had been asking for, so that as we moved into this planning process, both at the Bay Delta Conservation Plan and in the Water Board that I'll get to in a minute, that the fish's voice would be thrown into the mix rather than ignored. And then, of course, it was linked to the water problem. Okay, Delta Stewardship Council and their Delta Plan. I'm assuming that Phil talked about this at some length. I'm not going to spend a huge amount of time. Just a couple of observations on why this is important and significant, and it's still a work in process. The first thing is it's a 7-member council drawn from a diverse set of places, geographies, experience, and the like across California. And the goal of these people, and in my time on the Delta Council, I was on for about 2.5 years, maybe 3 years, 2.5. I'm not good with timing, I guess. I enjoyed it, but I had to give it up to take the Water Board slot. The people really take that seriously, that they may come with experience from a given set of players. I think people look to me to help give voice to the environmental point of view. Frequently I would give the ag or the Delta or the water agency point of view, in part because I think all of us viewed our job as trying to make sure that all the voices of California were heard versus being these small slices of things. The second key thing is that the time horizon of the Delta Council is supposed to be 50 to 100 years. If you look 50 to 100 years in advance at something like this, you're going to look at what you need to do today very differently. You can't ignore climate change with a 55-inch sea level rise looking at you. You can't just be, let's just get the deal done today. You really have to think about long-term infrastructure issues. You have to think about storage and snowpack. You have to think about alternative water supplies and the like. So that's important. There are other things in it that you see here. Review of BDCP is a big piece. Also review of development in the Delta, just so that land uses, a huge amount of the controversy has to do with land uses in the Delta behind those levees. And if an action is inconsistent with the Delta Plan, which is going to come out soon, someone can actually take it to court and challenge it. Hasn't happened yet, but for those of you who are lawyers or aspiring lawyers, watch this space as well. I think one of the most important tasks for the Delta Council, which they haven't done yet, is to create a council of governments. So they also are tasked in the law to bring together a council of all these different state agencies who are dealing with the Delta in very many places. And if you go to the Water Education Foundation website, you'll see this just horrifying graph that shows you how many different agencies touch the Delta, and somehow the Delta Council gets to be the camp counselor for all of that. And again, as with, yeah, they're going to have to bring donuts and all that sort of stuff. But as with the integrated water resource planning and estuary programs, if you know about those, and any number of government efforts, either voluntary or directed by law, to convene people in a room for a set purpose, it actually works. This is the ecosystem piece of this, whether it's, I did it with the Grand Canyon Visibility Transport Commission on tribal issues and the like. Different things happen when you get the people face to face who have to work on these issues rather than just complaining about each other to whoever will listen. And we're trying to move past that in contaminated groundwater, which, just as you know, will be one of the hottest issues in California over the next 2 years, thanks also to UC Davis. Some highlights I've talked about from the Delta Plan, the co-equal goals point being reinforced. Reduced reliance on the Delta has to do with making sure that if a governmental entity wants to put another straw into the Delta, they can't do it unless they've looked at all of the other things, from recycling to conservation, all kind of conjunctive use, etc., all kinds of alternative water supplies to stretch their supplies further, that they have an outage or disaster plan, a whole bunch of things that just say, look, we're not going to just keep sticking straws into this fragile Delta. Figure out how to stretch your water and use it more responsibly. You see some of the other things. Each one of them is really very big, and I'm happy to come back to this if any of them are interest to you. It's bigger than just the BDCP review. Multiple stressors I'm going to talk about in a moment. Frequently you will hear people talking about the Bay Delta, either about BDCP or about the Water Board's water quality control planning process, which I'm going to get to, and all anyone talks about is flow. It's not just about flow. Flow is probably the most important. Fish need water, obviously. And water helps to deal with all the other stressors, whether it's predators or contaminants or the lack of adequate oxygen within the water because of contaminants, invasive species, you name it, but it is not the only one. There are multiple stressors that are affecting the fish and wildlife, and we've got to come up with a way to deal with all of them in the appropriate way. That may seem obvious, but again, in the dialogue, it really needed to be reinforced. So again, it creates of itself kind of a governance, a thought governance model of sort of starting to put out all the things that people need to address in order to try and make progress. The Delta Plan has a direction for the state board to say, get your redo of these water quality control plans done quickly, because they can then form the foundation for all of the other decisions, whether BDCP or the like, that need to be made in the Delta. They set a foundational floor. I'm going to talk about that a little bit later. So clearly they've got to finish the plan. It's still not done. It's been hard to give birth to this plan. Then they still need to convene that council. They need to prioritize the levies in terms of where you would actually put some money into beefing them up. They've got to figure out financing. They've got to figure out how to incorporate all kinds of plans from a bunch of other agencies. And then, of course, they do have to make the BDCP decision. I just put some of the standards there so you could see what they were. Okay, so that's the Delta Council. Now we go number 2 to the State Board. I'm not going to give you a 101 about the State Board, which does a lot, water quality and water supply. It was created by merging 2 separate entities. Some states have them separately. I think some states must have them combined, but we sit as a quasi-legislative group that sets policy on water quality. We also sit in a quasi-judicial fashion to make water rights decisions in proceedings that can take months and years and are quite complex. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on that. That's also an issue for another day, but they play a really important role as a backdrop to what people's fears really are. So the main thing that we're supposed to do is to do what's called a water quality control plan for the Bay Delta and the San Joaquin River. It's actually an update of a plan that was done in 2006, which is an update of that plan that I mentioned that came out of the Bay Delta Accord in the 90s. There might be another one in between. Was there another one in between, Les? That's how many there are. And the water quality control planning process, I'll just give you again a gross simplification of it, which will give you a sense of why it's important. What we do in water quality planning, just as your local regional boards will do it for water bodies in your communities wherever you're from in California, or basically outside, because under state law other states do it as well, is they look at a water body, we look at a water body and we determine what are the beneficial uses for that particular water body. It can be fishing, it can be ag, it can be recreation, body contact, recreation not body contact, meaning you can go fish but you're not really going to go swimming in it, municipal drinking water, you get the picture. Any number of things that you would use. Yeah, some of them I'm sure White River rafting is one of the recreational uses. And then you come up with a plan that says, how do we come up with the balance of controls on different things to protect the maximum beneficial use of this particular water body. It takes a long time to do. It's very scientifically based. There's a lot of hearings, but it's a logical thing to say, what's the beneficial use of this water body? What's inhibiting those beneficial uses? And what do we need to do to maximize those beneficial uses? Seems fairly simple, but it's actually a fairly complex. But if you do it right, it sets a level playing field for folks to know what you're aiming at and give some direction to what can happen. Frequently, in the case of the Bay Delta, which is why the state board is doing, it deals with multiple regional board jurisdictions, but it also deals with water rights, because so much of it is about flow in the Bay Delta. So that's why you see it going with us. Other things that are significant to watch for as you watch the Delta drama unfold over the next couple of years. When the Bay Delta Conservation Plan, which I know you heard about from John Laird, and I presume you heard about it from a number of other people, when it does come out, a couple of things can happen. It can be appealed to the Delta Council, a series of reviews that you saw on one of my slides. Some certain criteria, it's not carte blanche or a plenary judgment, it's not de novo, it is if it meets certain criteria. It can also be appealed to court, which undoubtedly it will be by some people. But the Bay Delta Conservation Plan, which is a permit process to move the point of diversion, has to come to the state board for a water rights proceeding to move the point of diversion. So moving the point of diversion is a part of a water right as much as the quantity. So we will be important in that, and understanding what the Bay and the Delta need first is going to be important to being able to make that decision well. And then another role that we have, of course, I talked about multiple stressors, and we actually in our water quality have responsibility, or some responsibility in some way, for some of those stressors, whether it's hearing appeals from regional board permits for sewage treatment plants that discharge into the Delta, working on stormwater permits where urban stormwater contaminants go into the Delta, or doing appeals of permits for irrigated lands, meaning ag, that sends contaminants in the Delta. So we own a piece of it. We don't just stand out from the sidelines and say what everybody else ought to do. We have our own chunk of responsibility. Within the Bay Delta water quality planning process, you have you have 4 phases. The first one is dealing with that San Joaquin River as well as the South Delta water quality issues. Those are important for drinking water and ag water quality as well as for critters. The second is to deal with the Bay Delta issues. Those two, phase 1 and phase 2, are the two that we're really spending our focused time on. We're supposed to be done by 2014 per the Delta plan. Then implementation, and you see a kind of a mystery date for when it's done, is how we would implement the water rights that would be necessary to achieve that water quality control plan. Frequently when we do these things, the parties come together in some sort of a settlement, which is a lot faster than going through a multi-year bleak house type water rights proceeding. If we need to do that, we will, but frequently people do come together and propose something to us that they'll sign off on, thereby giving up their rights to go through that long proceeding. That will take any number of years, and then we have to do upstream TRIBs. Here are the key issues. I've already talked about some of them. Again, to remind you, co-equal goals. What that means is, if we could throw water at this issue and that would solve the whole problem, we can't, because the co-equal goals require us to balance. Fortunately, in our wheelhouse, we're supposed to balance under state and federal law, so we can balance the economics, we can balance water supply reliability with ecosystem restoration, but the fact that it's state policy puts an even bolder underline under the fact that we need to figure out how to do this most effectively for fish and wildlife, just dealing with that beneficial use, because that's the one that's the most controversial. But we need to figure out how to do it using the least amount of water that we can to maximize both. And that's where all of these different multiple stressors come in. I'm assuming, I know Tim talked a bit about fish and fisheries. We can come back to that. We can come back to any of these if they're of interest. How to factor in water supply alternatives, which someday I hope will be water supply mainstream. It's sort of like clean power being alternative energy, and now it's just cleaner green power. We're going to have to come up with another word for water conservation, water recycling, stormwater capture, treatment, reuse, etc., because there's a lot going on there that can stretch our water resources. I talked about salmon, anadromous fish that live their life cycle both in fresh and salt water. There are also issues with pelagic species like smelt. Smelt tend to grab more headlines because they're little and they're not very cute. So people who hate what the impact of them being endangered has on their water supply tend to focus on them. When you hear environmentalists talk about what needs to happen, they talk more about salmon. You can be the judge of why that happens, but sometimes what those two different kinds of species need is different, and we have to balance that as well. The water rights, I talked about it, and we do have a key governance role, but we don't have power over everything, including predation, which is one of these major factors, where striped bass, which is a prized sport fish regulated by the Department of Fish and Wildlife and prized by anglers, you know, there's a veritable McDonald's for them in salmon smolt because of this plumbing situation, and it has been very hard. In fact, rejected upping the take limits for striped bass. There may be some projects where we can find some hot spots and try and at least create a fairer fight for the salmon smolts in particular. BDCP, again, you've heard about this, but just a reminder, it's not a regulatory process. It's actually an application for a permit to build a thing and to mitigate for it with an incredible amount of habitat, which is one of the key things that fish need for a variety of reasons, fish and wildlife, but fish in particular. And it deals only with conveyance, doesn't deal with storage. It deals with a host of these stressors. It's a permit that has to meet certain standards, and the NCCP standard, the Natural Communities Conservation Planning process under state law requires not just that you do no harm to species, but you help restore them. Much higher standard. That's why environmental community was willing to say yes to the Delta Reform Act. It needs to meet that standard, or else it can't be included in the Delta Plan. You may say, why do we care? It doesn't get any state funding if it's not in the Delta Plan. So here's the timing on this one, and it becomes important also for the interplay with the water quality control plan, because we're hoping that the massive amount of work they've done on this soon to be released EIR actually can help form the basis for what we do in the Delta water quality control plan, so that we wouldn't have two agencies spending millions of dollars on the same data. So we'll see, and Les Grober, who's sitting here, will be the judge of that. He has the unenviable job of running this process. Governance for BDCP, of course, is at the heart of the challenge. I mean, fear was a big part of why the peripheral canal was defeated in the 80s. It's a big part of the fears that people have. If you look at, obviously you have the water suppliers down south are afraid that in the current setting, the water supply of California can be knocked out by saltwater intrusion if those levees go down, and hopefully you've seen the animations of that. Again, I think the earthquake risk is low risk but high impact. I think the impact from storm surge is probably more likely, and either way, something that important to 25 million Californians is definitely at risk. But you also have the folks in the Delta who are afraid that if you move that point of diversion, there won't be as much incentive to flush fresh water down through the Delta, and not only will their ag water quality be affected and their drinking water quality be affected, but then there won't be as much state interest in helping them pay to raise the levees. And they're afraid that this habitat restoration is going to take place on great swaths of the Delta, sort of dealing a death blow to the culture that they love, but also taking a lot of those lands out of ag production. And then, of course, many in the environmental community fear that if you just put another straw in, you're going to take twice as much out of the Delta, and that'll be the death blow for the fish. So fear is really the challenge, and governance of some sort is really the key to helping people feel comfortable with whatever comes out. So all of these processes, my bottom line, all of these processes are important for this working. I won't go through all of these, but just you have pro and con with the governance value of each of these. You know, the Delta Council has review authority, has a longer term view. It can convene the agencies. Doesn't really have a lot of power. It hasn't been tested yet. BDCP, there is a governance proposal in process, but it's kind of dense. It's got a number of groups. I just put in some of the acronyms both to give you an idea of what all these things look like. But you know, there is an authorized entity group that kind of runs it, that is the water supply agencies and some of the permittees. You have a permit, what is it called? A permit oversight group, which are the fish agencies. They wanted that separate. There's a stakeholder, and they're the ones who actually make the decision about how much water can go when. The stakeholder council would review everything. That includes people from the Delta, and then they need something day to day. And the current one is a thing called WAMPT that I will spare you what it is, but where people sit around and try to decide what to do. And then of course the fish agencies are the ultimate determining, since this would be a permit, they can cry foul and take the permit away if the rules are violated. Of course, we can set flow limitations, which can give people some comfort that you're not going to have twice as much water going south, and that the rules will, you know, we're like a court that you can come to see that these things are enforced, and we can work them into our certification of moving the point of diversion, etc. But again, as we go back to my original story, hasn't always been able to step up to the plate. Not because the folks at the water board aren't terrific, not because even the board members who are political appointees at a given time didn't wanna, but sometimes the politics of the moment, you have what Governor Wilson thought was the right thing to do in the late 80s. And so we haven't always been able to exercise our authorities, and we can change with different appointees, but we do control a lot of the parameters, and we do have a pretty good reputation among the players. And then we haven't even talked about the federal agencies. So I started to try and draw it, but I'm not going to go over it. I just started doing this today. You have this poor California Water Commission that has to decide on storage out there all by itself, and we're not sure how it connects to anybody. And then this one I put a whole bunch of agencies over the other. So anybody who's good at this stuff and wants a nice little project, I can't give you credit, but I really need someone with visual sense to help me do this. Okay, so what's the answer? And the answer is there are a bunch of answers. This is what Sonny McPeak, who's one of the players in this drama from a lot of different roles over the years as well. She was a supervisor. She was Secretary of Business, Transportation, and Housing later. She ran the Bay Area Council, but she, interestingly enough, she was one of the key leaders of the Delta Vision Task Force after having been one of the real leaders of the anti-peripheral canal fight in the 80s. But she says there's not a silver bullet, but there's probably silver buckshot, which is a lot of different answers. So it helps if each, I just gave you a few of the institutions with a role. If we each actually play our job well, and we actually are all trying to do our job at the same time, and as an outside observer, I've never seen that happen before. So that's really a good thing. We also need to recognize local solutions, and Jay talked about that a little bit in his talk, and I'm sure Mark Cowan is going to give you all kinds of great examples of what's been happening at the local level. I live in the world that deals with a lot of those local projects, and there are some pretty incredible things happening at the local level, not just in Southern California, but if you just take one example, if you look at what's happened in the Sacramento Valley about, I want to say more than a decade ago, probably 15 years ago, there was this pitched battle between bird groups and the rice industry because of the pesticides used then in rice growing. And actually, there was also an issue about the amount of water used in rice growing. Well, to make a long story short, the rice industry, the Nature Conservancy, Audubon, and those groups are now, they couldn't be closer. They're thick as thieves, and they've created the most amazing habitat for birds by just figuring out how to be for both. And I was just up there on Friday at their the Northern California Water Association annual meeting, and they had a huge presentation about, now let's figure out how to do it for salmon. Let's figure out how to generate, they want to generate salmon. Only problem is they get eaten up when they get down to the Delta, so they want the rest of us to do our job. In the Central Valley, people quietly are getting together and doing all kinds of groundwater conjunctive use projects on their own. They don't want the state to tell them what to do, but they're trying to figure out how to do it on their own. And then in Southern California, which is close to my heart because where I'm from, you would not, if you're not from Southern California, you wouldn't believe what's going on in terms of stormwater capture, treatment, and storage, where you have the flood control, the County Public Works Department and Flood Control Agency, which when I ran City Public Works used to refer to as that woman, actually about 10 years ago gave Tree People, which is a local brilliant group, nearly $100 million to work with to retrofit a watershed of a neighborhood, rather than, it was money they were going to spend raising the flood walls. Instead, they gave them that money and they've done cisterns on those houses, directing gutters into storage basins, permeable driveways, swales where the water can run into groundwater basins rather than running down the storm drains. And it's a raging success, not just in terms of flood control, but it also gives you water quality benefits, water supply benefits, and the like. Earlier last week, I spent 2 days with a bunch of people who had never been together before. It was so much fun to be able to make them come because I've had so many jobs. I can get people into the room because I've worked for them at one point or another. And you had people from Superfund, from public health, from local water agencies, from the Department of Water and Power, looking at the San Fernando Valley and San Gabriel Valley contaminated Superfund basins, figuring out how can we clean these up faster so we can use them for storage of groundwater, not just for groundwater treatment and use, but so we can use them and put recycled water in, so we can use them to put in stormwater. I mean, it's just incredible what's going on. So a series of those are going to be the answer. Climate change, I have to come back to. It is a game changer because of the Delta survival threat, but also because of the issue of flooding, which we didn't talk about, but also the issue of water supply and storage. That it's just, it makes it so that people really have to pay attention now. We can't keep passing the buck. And then again, in opportunities, belt suspenders, flying monkeys is what I always say. People are fighting about what they can do in a given deal. That doesn't mean we can't do it. What do we need? We need conveyance, we need storage, we need more conservation, recycling, stormwater capture, treatment, and storage, and we need to protect the levees a little bit more. Right now, it's not there's not enough money to do everything all at once, but if we do all of these things, we can both have a more secure water future, and we can make our water just go a lot further. We are not at all out of water, we just use it incredibly inefficiently. And I talked about some of these opportunities. That's belt suspenders, flying monkeys, sorry. Dating myself. Questions? I'm sorry I talked so fast. I just didn't know what you'd want to talk about, so I wanted to be able to focus on what's of interest to you after you've heard so many speakers.
I just want to say first, thank you for your talk. And you're actually one of the first people to talk about water quality instead of quantity. So I'm going to direct my question at that.
Great.
So it's been, the traditional solution to contaminants has been dilution. So what kind of plans do you have in terms of water quality control plans to deal with that, with water scarcity?
Well, there are a whole host of them, and we did something along this line just last month. There are a whole host of things. I went through them sort of quickly. I mean, there are what are called irrigated lands permits. Sometimes they're called ag waivers, where, you know, for the Clean Water Act's 40 years, we focused most of them on what are called point sources, you know, the big pipe coming out of a factory, a wastewater treatment plant, and we've done really well with that. There are some exceptions, and we finally just cranked down on the Sacramento regional plant just a couple of months ago in hearing an appeal from the regional board. So we have that kind of under control nationally. Where most of our water quality impairment is, and if you go to our website, we've got just all kinds of maps on this stuff from doing those, trying to figure out beneficial uses and designate them. We also have maps of where those beneficial uses are impaired. And where you see the impairment is where you've got these diffuse sources now, ag, where it's just lots of different farms, a lot of different activity in a diffuse way, adding to the problem in terms of runoff. It also has a groundwater issue, but there's also a surface water issue. Urban stormwater is the other real big one, and we're finally taking those on. Years late by, I think, a lot of folks in the environmental movement's view, with incredible rapidity with those people who are going to be regulated. The phases were sort of, you do industrial, then they did municipal in the 80s. Finally, we did federal facilities in the 90s. Somehow I've been involved in each of these waves. I don't know how. I mean, like, I happen to have surfed them just timing-wise, which is good or it could be bad. I always say my karma ran over my dogma in this one because I always end up in a position to have to do the thing I said somebody ought to do. And then federal facilities, DOD, and then finally we're getting to urban stormwater and ag. And so we've got these irrigated lands permits moving through the system, and then the urban stormwater permitting is moving through the system. We just did one for smaller communities a couple of weeks ago, and we put in it an alternative path for folks who were if they have a plan that does more than just water quality, like they have a longer term plan for greening their community, daylighting streams, doing all of that to absorb, use a natural system to absorb pollutants and to absorb water for water supply and green their communities, then we'll give them an alternate path. That was sort of a big breakthrough. But the bottom line is that water quality's got to be met. That's just a few. There's more, but those are the big three: are sewage treatment plant, industrial discharges, ag drainage, and stormwater, urban stormwater. Which urban stormwater, oddly enough, has more pesticides in it than you would think. It's not just ag. The pyrethroids and others that are used in terms of pest control inside houses are a huge problem.
That's a really good question. We could probably have another whole series.
You should have a whole series that on groundwater. Nitrate contamination of the groundwater basins, part of the UC Davis report that Jay and Thomas Harder did, have sparked incredible public awareness, but also legislative awareness. I mean, the reports were sparked by legislation that told the Water Board to do two reports, one on overall groundwater contamination and another on nitrates, in particular contracted with UC Davis to do the nitrate report. And there are like 9 bills already introduced to deal with the issue, and it's a whole, I love that issue. It's horrible, but it's great. Just because it's a thorny public policy issue. Again, where there is this odd, unlikely alliance coming together of agreement between ag and community organizers, EJ folks, that we need to get drinking water to the people who are drinking contaminated water, A, because that's a good thing to do, and B, because it'll give us the time to deal with cleaning up the nitrate contamination over the decades it took to get there. So it's fascinating.
Isn't California a great place to study water problems?
That's amazing.
Are there additional questions?
You mentioned that groundwater is locally regulated. Do you ever foresee the state having any control over groundwater water rights? Or do you think the local entities are doing a pretty good job?
You know, I think that's an interesting question. I think it's a question of phasing, which is, you know, water rights in general and water management in California is kind of frustrating. I don't know how many of you have seen those, you know, those little games, they're like square and they have those little squares in them and you're supposed to move them around to make them spell something, and what you really want to do is take a screwdriver and like pop them all out. But that's kind of what it's like. It's accreted over time. So a lot of what happens in water, I will tell you, I told the governor this, and some of you have heard me say it, having been at EPA and at the local level doing garbage and sewage. I'm basically a garbage sewage girl, which makes me very practical, I like to say. Because when you're dealing with a river of human waste coming at you 24 hours a day, it's hard to, you know, stand on a soapbox. You got to get it, you kind of got to get it done. But it's kind of accreted over time in California. You know, you have these pre-1914 rights, area of origin that are superior. So when we do our water rights stuff, it's this very tough puzzle of not just what would be the beneficial uses if you're doing it all equally, like who would be best able to contribute. You've got to have a whole overlay and filter of what their water rights are, which come out of law. They also come out of custom, and in groundwater in California, it's like a custom that we don't have state regulation. So to get it would take a lot, and I think these other things that are on our plate are sort of more front and center, and I actually think that encouraging those local efforts that people can relate to, where they're talking to their neighbors rather than those awful state people. Try being a Fed, they think you're a jackbooted thug with black helicopters, or I remember being called in the Arizona Republic flag-waving commie bastard, I think was what they said. But the same person who said it when I showed up in the legislature to talk about an air issue showed up and wanted to know. I mean, there's the rhetoric and there's the reality. They actually want to know what they could do about it. It's funny, they call names, but strange. But so I don't see it happening anytime soon, but I see little places where we can improve what's happening at the local level. And then the what's the right word? When more of that stuff happens at the local level, you'll probably start seeing a call for more people to do it. I'm sort of more of a Malcolm Gladwell tipping point person or a chaos theorist about how change happens. I think it's better to foster your early adopters and show it can work and that it's not scary rather than imposing it because it theoretically seems good. I mean, that's my closing Yogi Berra quote I didn't use is, in theory, there's no difference between theory and practice. In practice, there is. And in practice, I think it's much better to build people's practical, real knowledge. So I'd rather keep supporting the integrated waste planning type project and then find other ways to reward that work. That was a long answer. I hope that was the question you were asking. It'd be really bad if there were other questions.
There's more questions? Answer cleverly, you can run all back and forth.
As a follow-up to that, I don't know how on your radar it would be, but could you talk about the Scott River case and if that could maybe catalyze the conjunctive management regulatory scheme?
It's a good question. I don't know enough about it. I know about it enough to see the letters coming in and to have seen a picture, and I know our staff is focusing on the Scott River case. It's not the only place, but I don't know enough about it to be able to give you a thoughtful answer. Now I have homework.
Is that the fisheries case situation you're talking about?
Yeah, they're being sued by.
Yeah.
I can't help myself. I was going to say something similar to that,
Okay,
but I wanted to just bring it up that case where the fisheries agency steps in and they tried to regulate the permits for the diverters to take water and to try and come at their regulatory authority from a different angle. And they were taken to court and they were told that by the judge that you can't do it this way. And kind of both like the environmentalists, they thought it was kind of a victory because they wanted the fisheries agencies to be able to do more. And the agriculture people said, this is a victory for us because we got this stopped. But I was having the same sort of thoughts as the state water board or the Water Resources Control Board. Have you guys thought about your authority and how you could start maybe like slipping a little more into groundwater, maybe from even a strategic point of view that you don't really have a legal basis to do it, but if you strategy-wise did something, maybe it would spark legislation or something to move forward?
No, there are things we can do. I mean, Les probably can explain this better than I can. I think, what you want to be doing is looking for those situations where you can make a point that's really important both to that place and somewhere else. I mean, I think if you ask me, there's a part of the Constitution that we talked about all those water rights, but there's also a constitutional provision about waste and unreasonable use. And so we can use that for groundwater as well as surface water to say that however that water is being managed is a waste and unreasonable use of what is essentially a public resource. And I think that's the kind of place where we're looking for those sort of cases that have, I don't know if the word is legs, but where you file a case that's obvious to everybody that you're right. Whereas usually people come to us, and this may be a good case for doing something similar. I just don't know enough of the details. I know at some point I will have to, but I haven't dived into it yet. You want to look for, in my view, you want to look for those cases that feel obvious and that are have a teachable moment in it. And I think if groundwater basins are severely overdrafted, we can call it, because there is a connection between ground and surface water, as I mentioned when I talked about ag conservation and why it's not one-to-one with urban conservation.
More questions?
I know you talked about this a little bit, but can you talk about the peripheral canal a little bit and how the governor's new plan addresses some of the problems that we got tonight for?
Oh, sure. I'm sorry. I went fast because of that. I mean, the whole point of having a peripheral canal or tunnels is to be able to take the water from the bigger water course and not have the problem of the reverse flow of those pumps at the bottom, which is exacerbated by the fact that there's not that much water coming in from the San Joaquin in the first place. So in particular, those fish that are trying to make it back and forth from the San Joaquin just don't have much of a fighting chance. So if you can take water up here where there's more water coming down to begin with and not get into that series of channels in the delta at all in the first place, your fish you're going to have a much greater fish survival. It still has to be governed by how much water though, because overall, you know, fish need water, and the water is important not just for getting them where they need to go, it's important for them. There needs to be enough water, not to dilute contaminants, which is the whole dilution is the solution to pollution paradigm of the past, because we've got to deal with taking the contaminants out too, but it helps on contaminants. It helps on their migration. It helps on invasives, because certain kind of flow patterns favor invasive species, whether it's some of the clams or other ones that come in and then gobble up the food in the food web that you really want to be going into the zooplankton and the copepods that the fish need to eat. I mean, it gets into their food supply. Flow helps with that stuff. You know, it's sort of the native fish evolved where there was more habitat, and then the Delta Plan has tens of thousands of acres of habitat, which is important both for generating food, just because the food through the biological process comes through there, but also creating little hiding places for the little fish to hide from the predators. I mean, it's really a big deal. If you look at places like the Yolo Bypass where folks have been creating more habitat, you're getting an incredible generation of food source, but also a place where the fish can take their time and make their way where they need to go. And so the basic parameter of the deal is change the point of diversion and get a bunch of habitat in, and then there's a bunch of other things. And that has more of a shot at getting the fish to come back, which means that the biological opinions that come from the fish agencies aren't going to, they never shut the pumps down. It's not going to crank the pumps down as much, because you don't have to crank them as much. You have to crank them down because they're doing the reverse flow thing and fish are getting chewed up. So if you don't have that reverse flow, you don't have as much water cutbacks. So that's sort of the basic premise. The fear is, as I said, the Delta folks fear that if you don't have to keep the water quality good at the bottom of the Delta, then they don't have folks in Southern California with all the money pushing politically to get their levees strengthened. The fact is we need to strengthen those levees too, because we're always going to use both of them. It needs to be a more flexible system, not one or the other, because there are times when you can draw it from the south too and it doesn't necessarily hurt the fish. And environmentalists fear that if you just add another diversion that somehow you're going to be able to take twice as much. I mean, in theory, you could pump from the southern delta as much as people are afraid of in BDCP. It's just the fish agencies would stop you. But the plan that the governor endorsed is smaller than the plan that the Schwarzenegger administration endorsed. It's scaled back. It's building it to the same size, because if you build it big, you can use gravity, so it has an advantage in terms of pumping and greenhouse gas emissions. But they're trying to limit it to 9,000 CFS. The environmental proposal says try 3 and then get the rest of your water through water use efficiency, recycling, and all of that. The answer is going to be some mix, probably, of those. So,
about recycling municipal wastewater, is anyone getting a handle on if we meet the state's goals for that, how much that might reduce inflows to the Delta?
You know, I'm sure I've seen it. I've seen those numbers. I just don't have them at the top of my head. You know, as you know, the recycled wastewater isn't fungible. I mean, we're a long way from direct potable reuse. That costs. You can do it. It's not rocket science. I don't know if you guys were listening. They're trying to figure out how to do it going to Mars, because they need to. You can recycle in your suit for a short little voyage, but to Mars. But having been in water treatment, it's not rocket science. It's a question of dollars and energy in terms of membranes, reverse osmosis, and the like. So there's some limited, but it's a lot. I mean, even if you look at my big treatment plant in LA, the Hyperion treatment plant, 6th largest river in the state of California. If it were a river, it's a lot of water, 400 million gallons a day. That's like what, 40,000 acre, how much is that? 40,000 acre feet? 400? I don't know how to do the acre foot.
1,000 acre feet bay, which is 500 CFS.
Oh yeah, there you go. So it's a lot. So in any event, we had plans, the biggest plans in the state of California. They're only partway there, but Orange County Water District has already cleaned LA's clock on this. So it's happening, but it's not going to happen overnight. Again, this is got to be a paced, phased approach, and one where you pay attention to some of the unintended consequences, like contaminants of emerging concern, endocrine disruptors, all the viruses. There's just a little, I mean, every river in the country is recycled wastewater. I don't know, people don't realize that. Mississippi River, how many times do you think that's been drunk, each molecule of water? Same's true of the Sacramento River and all of that, but doing it directly is another story.
Well, it affects water rights too, and could reduce inflows in rivers depending on how it's recycled.
No, that's exactly true. When we were expanding the Tillman Reclamation Project in the city of LA and the valley, very proud of it being bigger, a reporter said to me, well, if you're really successful, then you'll dry up the LA River. Because 2/3 more, like 80% of the LA River is LA's tertiary treated wastewater, and it's great. If there's a potential. It's not just for Terminator movies anymore. There's real potential down there with the LA River. But I said, when we get to that part, I'll be happy. That's my problem. When that's my problem, when we're deciding how to allocate recycled water to rivers versus reuse, that'll be good. But we have a long way to go, I think.
Great. Well, I think we better stop there. Thank you all.
Right.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Hope it was helpful.